Well, good morning, all. Welcome to Baptist Theological Seminary at Richmond and our last in the Life in the Vine series of Coffee and Conversation. We're glad you all are here. Many of you all have been with us throughout the series. We're kind of sad to see this one wrap up with our congregational focus, but we will be doing a similar series next year around spirituality. So we welcome you all, invite you to join us for that. We want to thank Hampton Baptist Church who made this event possible with their gift in honor of Chester Brown. And this morning it is my honor and pleasure to introduce to you the Reverend Dr. John W. Vest, Visiting Assistant Professor of Evangelism for Union Presbyterian Seminary. Now, I'm not sure how many of you all know this or not, but I learned recently that Union Presbyterian Seminary have revised their seminary curriculum. It is true. They've made several changes, and among many changes, the faculty devised a Church in the World curricular component. And students are now required to do coursework and supervise ministry in three vital areas. Interfaith study is the first, community engagement is the second, and the E word is the third, evangelism, believe it or not. So Union needed a professor to teach evangelism, and while doing so, to make use of technology, media, particularly social media, they did a nationwide search, and they found that professor in John Vest. John's a gifted scholar and pastor. He received a BA in Religious Studies and Ancient Mediterranean Civilizations from Rice University, his MDiv from the University of Chicago Divinity School, a Doctor of Ministry from McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago, and he's also studied at Hebrew University in Jerusalem and fulfilled PhD coursework requirements in Hebrew Bible at University of Chicago's Div School. John has also served as pastoral intern, pastoral associate at Community Presbyterian Church in Illinois, as associate pastor of youth ministry for Fourth Presbyterian Church. He was the moderator for the Presbytery of Chicago and is a member of the Society of Biblical Literature, the American Academy of Religion, the Presbyterian Youth Workers Association, and the Association of Presbyterian Church Educator. So in other words, folks, John's a really gifted, networked, and busy guy. Lastly, and most importantly, John is married to Ann. They live in Glen Allen. They have two sons, Noah and Elijah. And during his free time, John prepares barbecue for Barbecue Church, which is one of his personal evangelism initiatives. So, John, we welcome you to BTSR. Come now and encourage us to re-examine the E word. We welcome you today.
Thanks a lot. It's great to be here, and I wasn't sure what to expect. This is actually a little more formal than I was expecting, so I'll try to do my best behind a podium talk. But then, as I understand it, this is really an opportunity for conversation. So I'll give you some conversation starters, and then we can go in whatever direction you want to go. One thing when I met for lunch to talk about this, I mentioned this, and this still sort of strikes me as kind of funny that only in 2017 would a Baptist seminary invite a progressive Presbyterian who used to be a Southern Baptist to come and talk about evangelism. So I was raised in the Southern Baptist Church, and I take it I may not be the only former Southern Baptist or recovering Southern Baptist in the room. So I was raised with a particular understanding of evangelism. And once I felt called to ministry in high school, actually, did some of that very typically Southern Baptist evangelism of knocking on doors and asking people, if you were to die tonight, where would you go? And all that kind of stuff. So I'm familiar with that. When I went to college in Texas, really all of the fundamentalist faith that I had developed in high school, and I went all in, all of that was really deconstructed as I studied religion in a secular, non-religiously affiliated college. And that really was kind of a crisis of faith time for me, as I discovered. And I'm happy that I came out on the other side of that with a reassembled sort of different faith, what I noticed in a lot of my friends was they just came to the conclusion that this whole Christianity enterprise was so fraught with problems and so problematic that they just didn't have anything to do with it anymore. So before I even knew the words nuns or duns, which is very popular in our thinking about religion in America today, I witnessed a lot of my friends in college go through that experience of sort of turning their back and say, I don't want anything to do with this anymore. But I stuck with it and sort of found my way into the Presbyterian Church and to the PCUSA. I had a brief interlude in the PCA, the Presbyterian Church of America, which was a good, I think, stepping stone for me from the Southern Baptist Church to the PCUSA. Once I became involved in church leadership in the Presbyterian Church, I realized the longer I was there that there was something in my DNA still from my Baptist days that led me to believe that what we were doing ought to matter and to make a difference in the lives of individuals and in the world that we lived in. It was really clear to me when I was a Southern Baptist what was at stake in the enterprise of evangelism, that if my friends or my family didn't accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior, or didn't sort of sign on to a particular list of doctrines and dogmas about Jesus, that their eternal soul was in peril of being in hell for all of eternity. So it was clear that I had a motivation to share faith with them. It was never so clear to me in the Presbyterian Church or in mainline Protestantism in general what that motivation is or what's at stake. In fact, it seemed to me that there wasn't much at stake at all. The church was a place where we would come to receive some kind of individual uplift or some inspiration or maybe some solace or comfort, and that it would be a launching pad for doing charitable or good deeds in the community. But the more and more now we realize that you don't need Jesus or religion to do all those good social justice things. And there's plenty of people out there who are doing amazing things in the world with no connection to faith at all. And it's more and more the case that folks are just not compelled or interested in what our churches are doing or offering. And so you have now the fastest growing segment of the religious population in the United States are those so-called nuns, the unaffiliated, folks who have no religious affiliation. And that's certainly been the case in the Presbyterian Church USA, which has been on a precipitous membership decline for the last 50 years. So sometimes I have charts that show how dire that looks, but basically the Presbyterian Church is less than half it was 50 years ago. And other mainline denominations are in that similar boat. And what really, I think, though, has started to gain more national attention is a couple years ago when evangelical denominations like the Southern Baptist Church also started to either flatline or decline themselves. And people started to take notice that something is happening and changing in the American religious landscape. Now, I sometimes start with that because I think that a lot of times when people, at least in my mainline context, when they think about evangelism and why we should even have this conversation about evangelism, the first thing that their mind goes to is we have to fix the hemorrhaging of our members, and somehow we have to save our churches and, by extension, our institution, right? So if, the Presbyterian Church, like a lot of denominations, I would say is in a crisis time in terms of its long-term viability. If we're losing about around 90 to 100,000 members every year and don't replicate or replace them with either folks coming from other denominations or brand new Christians, then we're in serious viability trouble, and we're not alone in that. So I often think that that's what people first think about, and certainly churches that I work with here in the Richmond area, the churches that actually take the initiative to call me up and say, come in, we need some help with evangelism. Usually it's because they've painted themselves into a corner and they realize that they're about to go under if they don't do something very different. That's probably not the best reason to talk about evangelism because that sort of puts you in a numbers game. And has your mindset being more about institutional survival or stability than what it should be about, which is the good news, the gospel, which Jesus twice in the New Testament uses the words church in the Gospels, only twice in the Gospels, twice in the Gospel of Matthew. There's reason to believe that both of those maybe were later editorial additions, because it seems that more of what Jesus was interested in was the expansion or the growth of God's kingdom, what he talked about as God's kingdom. And so partly we need to move away from this church growth paradigm into a kingdom growth paradigm and think about what does it mean to be not just faithful in terms of I'm trying to do my best to do what God has called me to do, but also to be fruitful. Because that's a metaphor that Jesus used quite a bit, to be fruitful and multiplier, to bear fruit that will last. And so how do we do that as a church, as a congregation, or more broadly speaking, as denominations? One of the things that I've discovered in the Presbyterian context, and based on the invitation for me to be here and the title that was given for this talk, is that we're not all in agreement on what evangelism is. And some folks have that very narrow definition, like I was raised in the Southern Baptist Church, that has to do with conversion. Some folks on sort of the other end of that spectrum will say that everything that we do as Christians somehow or another bears witness to the gospel, which theoretically I agree with that. But generally, if you think that way, it sort of means that evangelism doesn't mean anything, because it by de facto means everything. So it doesn't really help very much. And I noticed even within the search committee that called me and drew me to Union, that there was a wide range of definitions of what evangelism is. And I took it upon myself, both within the context of the seminary and the Presbytery of the James, where I work here, to try to develop a working definition that could, regardless of what your theological perspective is, that you could find an entryway into that. What I've discovered is the most sort of troubling stumbling block when it comes to how we think about evangelism is that question of conversion. Is evangelism primarily about conversion, to change someone's religious perspective or their religion or their mindset to match yours? Or is there something else involved there? One of the books that I often use in my teaching and recommend is a short book by Doug Pagitt called Evangelism in the Inventive Age. It's part of a 4-book series of In the Inventive Age books that he's done. And what I like about the first chapter of this book, Evangelism in the Inventive Age, is he makes the claim that evangelism is not about conversion. Instead, he says evangelism is about resonance, and uses as a metaphor or an illustration the tuning forks. If you remember doing that tuning fork experiment in high school or whenever you did it, the way the tuning fork sort of demonstration works, if you have 2 tuning forks that are both made of the same composition and they vibrate at the same frequency, if you strike one, the airwaves will pick up that vibration and travel across and make the other one ring with the same tone. And so he suggests that that's what evangelism is like, is that we are communicating both through our words and our actions, good news, the good news that we ourselves experience, with the hope that that might resonate with other people and that they might pick up on that and sort of share in that. Now, the beauty of that metaphor, I think, is that you can't do that with 2 tuning forks that vibrate at different frequencies, right? It just won't work. So you have to have more than one frequency going out into the world if you hope to reach a variety of people, because we don't all vibrate at the same frequency. We have different resonances because we're all wired and built a little differently. And Doug actually does something great, I think, in that book, where he uses the Enneagram as a way to sort of tease that out. Right, so if you're familiar with the Enneagram, it's like the Myers-Briggs, except it's actually rooted in spirituality, and sort of helps us think about how we connect with God and to other people, and also what blocks us from connecting to God and to other people. And so if each of us has a different frequency, and you can think about it in terms of that Enneagram, we need to be sharing good news and by extension, I would say, doing church in a variety of different frequencies, because it's not going to reach everyone in the same way. And so in a local congregational context, if the pastor is the only person who's doing the evangelizing or the faith sharing, and in most of our congregations, that's the case. And really the only primary form of evangelism that we do is the Sunday preaching moment. If there's only one person who is communicating good news at one frequency, that's only going to reach a certain number of people. So we have to think about evangelism within our communities as a community-wide endeavor. We can't just rely on the professional Christian to do that. Everyone has to be involved in that. And we have to have a variety of different expressions of faith in a variety of different ways that we articulate and share our experience of God and the good news. So the working definition of evangelism that I've sort of landed on is that evangelism is talking about and demonstrating our relationship with God in such a way that it might resonate with other people and invite them into their own relationship with God. So part of that is to say that I'm not going to take my experience as normative and that you have to conform to my way of thinking or my way of believing. But I'm going to be open and transparent and very generous with my experience of God and how I relate with God, with the hope that other folks might sort of catch on to that and be a part of that. The other piece of the definition that I think is important is that it's not just the demonstration, but also the talking. You may have heard at some point Francis of Assisi, this famous quote to, share the good news and use words if necessary. Presbyterians and I think some other folks have taken that to the extreme and never use words. And so we think that if we just are good people and do good things, that somehow or another people are going to catch on to the fact that we do that because of our faith in Jesus Christ. One of my students last year in the first class that I taught, she's a young woman that was raised in a good Presbyterian church, went to a Presbyterian campus ministry, and had a great youth group experience before that, and then came straight to seminary. So she's sort of following like the perfect Presbyterian path. She said, I was raised my whole life with that way of thinking, that if I was going to live life well and follow Jesus in my life, that someone was going to come up and say, why do you do those things that you do? And that would be my opportunity to say, because of Jesus. She said, that's never happened. And almost every time that I share that, I don't have anyone that say, oh yeah, that's happened to me. Every now and then that's happened. But by and large, especially in today's world, today's post-Christendom world, that's just not going to happen. And so we have to help connect the dots in a way that we maybe didn't have to before. So that's one sort of conversation starter I want to throw out. The other one is this. A refrain that I continue to use over and over, and I'm more and more convinced of this and would be happy to talk about it in a variety of contexts, is the claim that attractional church no longer works. And what I mean by that, attractional church no longer works, is that church growth strategies that are based on creating more attractive and compelling programs and worship services and even outreach opportunities, which themselves become sort of the bait to draw in people into our membership. All those church growth strategies that are based on creating better programs or better worship, that's not working anymore. It used to work for a while. And the reason for that, there's several reasons for that. Some which are theological, and we could talk about that perhaps. But one really clear reason that doesn't work anymore is that there are fewer and fewer people in the United States who are interested in that way of connecting with God or that way of faith formation. And so essentially every church that employs that strategy, which is almost every church that I know, is competing with each other for the same shrinking piece of the pie, which are people that like church and the people that connect with God in the particular forms and ways that we've been doing it for 300 plus years on this continent. There are fewer and fewer people out there. That's why the rise of the nones or the spiritual but not religious is an important phenomenon to pay attention to, because those are folks that aren't atheists necessarily or agnostics, but folks for whom the particular way that we do this just doesn't get them anymore. So instead of that attractional model, we have to come up with something else. people always point out and say, well, there are certain churches that clearly are growing using that model, and that's true. And I served one. The last church I served in Chicago was the second largest Presbyterian church in the country within our denomination. And we were, like, I'd say, the prototypical attractional church approach. We had the best preachers. We had a paid choir. We had programs for every age level. We could do all of those things. And churches like that are growing, but they're all growing at the expense of other churches that are slowly dying, because we're basically just stealing those people. Even though we're not trying to do that, that's what's happening. And that's not just like a mainline phenomenon. That's even within the larger evangelical denominations or non-denominational churches. The statistics show that across the board, the vast majority of new members in any congregation are transfers from other churches, or folks that used to be part of a church and then stopped for a while and then came back. There are actually very few adult baptisms, relatively speaking, and brand new conversions in any American church, which is really interesting. So we're all competing for that same segment of the population, which is shrinking faster than the opposite is growing. The other piece of that is a sociological reason. If I had more time, we could spend some time with, but let me try to simplify it to this. If you've ever read, this is 20 years old now, Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam. So he made this argument 20 years ago that America's connections with each other are depleting. We're losing what he called social capital, that something about the fabric of American community, we're not as connected to each other as we used to be. And he sort of studied that primarily through the decline of membership-based organizations, like churches, but also pick any kind of civic organization like the Rotary Club or Kiwanis Club or the Elks Lodge or American Legion or whatever, or bowling leagues, which he used for his title, that all of those are declining in membership. And instead, people are finding different ways of relating to each other. He sort of saw that as a crisis that we have to fix. Other folks, other sociologists have said, maybe it's just that we're shifting to a different way of connecting. And most recently, folks are using social network models to think about how our community, or how community is based and how our culture is connected to each other. So the upshot is that membership-based organizations are declining across the board in the United States. And people now, as networked individuals, are connecting to each other through a vast array of social networks. And by that, I don't just mean digital social media platforms. That's one way to enact a social network. But what anthropologists and social psychologists tell us is that human beings have basically related to each other the exact same way from the beginning of human history. We just have different technologies or different social configurations of how we put those together. But now, if we're connected primarily through social networks, all of those membership-based organizations are struggling to sort of redefine themselves, and the church is one of those. So the very way that we're based and constituted as a membership-based organization is an anachronism in today's world of social networking. And again, I don't just mean like Twitter and Facebook and all of that, just the very ways that through our entire lives we connect with people more through relational connections and less through memberships. There's a fundamental mismatch between the way the church is organized and the way we do our life together and the way that people actually live their lives elsewhere. That somehow or another we have to bridge that mismatch. And we either need to do that by trying to convince a culture to go back to different ways of being together, and some folks try to do that, and some folks actually have some success with that. Or the other approach would be, how do we adapt church to be more of a social network and less of a membership-based organization, which I think is an evangelism question. Evangelism isn't just, I think, the nuts and bolts of faith sharing, but it's also bigger picture questions of how we do church and how we organize ourselves and how we connect with other people. So let me stop there. And I think now we're going to have times for questions and conversation. Hopefully I gave you something to be angry about and to question me or challenge me on, or just to agree with me on, or if you have any questions about what I do at the seminary or in this presbytery. Yes, sir. Not enough. If you want my honest answer, I guess this is online. I probably shouldn't have said that. I mean, partly they called me there, to be honest, and I think that's part of my charge. What I've discovered in 2 years of being on the flip side of theological education, I mean, I was a student in theological education for most of my adult life, and so I experienced it on that side. Now that I'm on the other side, what I'm realizing is that seminaries are even more entrenched and in some cases intractable than churches are, partly because we're like one step further removed from reality. Whereas like we are training the people that are leading churches, and we sort of don't actually come into contact with real people enough. And so, and you know, our seminaries are really by definition still participating in that attractional model. Like our whole job is to attract students. And so we keep using the same models over and over. So what I've discovered is that we spend a lot of time thinking about, and this may be true for this seminary, I don't know, spend a lot of time thinking about what we want to teach, what we think is important, what we think should be defining the future of the church, rather than listening and paying attention to what are the actual skill sets that the emerging church or faith leaders need in this world that is vastly different from when all of our seminaries were founded. So Union just celebrated its 200-year anniversary. And Union basically was created at the exact same time as Princeton and a couple of the other Presbyterian seminaries, Columbia in particular. And the whole reason those seminaries were founded is because there were tons and tons of Presbyterian congregations without educated clergy. And it became impractical for Presbyterians to send their clergy to Scotland to receive training, as it was before that. So they said, we're going to create our own seminary. So the instigating problem that created seminaries, our seminaries at least, was churches without pastors. That is not our problem now. Now we have pastors without churches. And I think part of our challenge is we're primarily training pastors and educators for existing church jobs, and there are fewer and fewer of those every year. Whereas what I keep trying to instigate at Union and elsewhere is that we need to completely sort of change our mindset to be more like missionaries, post-Christendom missionaries, and not only that, to start to learn the skills of entrepreneurship that we need to create new things. I mean, I had a class a year ago in May where it was called Post-Congregational Evangelism. And the idea was, and I didn't know that I was going to frame it this way, but I just happened that morning, went to look at our placement match system. And there were about 300 people in our system that were looking for first-time calls. Like they were, didn't require any experience. So these are the entry-level church jobs, and there were only 100 of those church jobs, right? So I said, you have a 1 in 3 chance of getting one of these existing jobs. So you either need to hope that you're one of those lucky few, or you need to figure out how you're going to live out your sense of call in a different way. And here are some ideas and ways to think about that. And I think part of our problem is we're still really only focused on training folks for these existing jobs, and that we need to instead say, you've been called here because you felt something stir within you that you want to serve God in the world in a particular way. Let's figure out how to do that and not count on the infrastructure of the existing institution. But I think lots of seminaries are so stuck in that it's hard to see outside of that. So I think we're making steps in that direction, and we are trying to create, like we've just gone through another revision of our curriculum that's trying to make it as adaptable as we can, understanding that a lot of students that come through our doors aren't even thinking that they want to be parish pastors anymore, and that they want to do other things. And so we're trying to create a curriculum that gives them some more latitude and freedom to do that. I still think we have some more work to do, especially in terms of that kind of entrepreneurial, creating new things, and missionary style of leadership. I think the other comment about that I would raise is that we haven't totally come to terms yet with what religious leadership in the 21st century looks like. I think we still, at the seminary level, operate as if what people are looking for in their religious leader is the local expert in religion. I mean, that's like, our curricula are based on amassing a certain amount of knowledge that you can then impart to people. While that's important, and I'm not trying to downplay that, in today's world, most people could learn more about, Isaiah from their phone than they could from most pastors. What they're looking for out of their religious leaders are something more akin to spiritual directors, right? So spiritual directors are folks who are trained to help people recognize God's presence in their life in the world, and how to live in that, and to articulate that, and to follow God in immediate ways in their lives. I think that's what actually people want. And we're not always giving, I think, our students those skills or that experience. So that's another way that I think we need to reformulate theological education. I am convinced, sorry I keep going on in response to this question, but having moved from the parish to the academy now, or the seminary world, I'm definitely convinced that if we're going to have the kind of cultural change that I think we need to have, that it's got to start in our seminaries. And as you may know, that's a hard institution to change. So anyway, what else? Yes, sir.
Given the strength of the academy, how are you building capacity in seminary students to build these new social frameworks? How are you awakening the consciousness of local congregations of these massive shifts?
Yeah, I forgot I was supposed to repeat the question. So the question was, given the constraints of seminary theological education, what are we doing to awaken the capacity within students to do this more social network kind of ministry, and also how to do that with congregations? Oh, that's a huge question. I mean, I guess, what I'm personally doing is I teach classes that incorporate that way of thinking. So I keep coming back to this paradigm shift that the church has missed in the way that our culture and relationships are grounded and built, that we're behind like 50 years, in terms of how we think America works. So I keep raising that. I'm also, one of the things that I'm doing is, in my spare time or whatever, I think of it as part of my work at the seminary and the presbytery, is I'm doing a new worshiping community that we call the Joyful Feast. And if you're interested, it's thejoyfulfeast.net, that we're envisioning as this more of a social network from the ground up. I think it's really hard to convince a church that its DNA has been built as a membership-based organization to change to this new. That's a pretty huge pivot. But if you start something from the ground up, I think there's some possibility there. So we're doing these experiments of different ways of doing church that are grounded in the more network model, so that I can say, look, here, this is working, and here's some examples of how to do that. And the students are really engaged in that. I've certainly found that students are more open to this than the existing churches. And that half of my life sometimes is more frustrating. because to just convince folks to do something completely different from the way they've done it before is really challenging. But some churches have got to the point, you might call it of desperation, that they're willing to try something new because they can clearly see that what they're doing is not working. I'm working with a church now that 5 years ago was deciding whether it should even stay open. They had 50 members. They decided we're going to give it one more go, call the pastor for 5 years, and 5 years later that pastor just retired. They still only have 50 members, and they've had to now go down to a half-time non-installed pastorate. And they're at the point now where I think they can see that what we're doing isn't working, and so they're open to me coming in there and saying, why don't you try this? Why don't you try that? The biggest, I think, way to help students and churches like that to, I like the way that you said it, sort of awaken their capacity for that, is to get them out of the building and put them out into the world. So this church happens to be really close to the South of the James Farmers Market, which is in Forest Hill. And it's the best farmers market, I think, in the city. And if you just spend time there, and that's in fact one of the ways that the Joyful Feast sort of got launched, is we spent a lot of time there, and it helped shape our mission and our vision. You could start to see and imagine something very different. This church that I'm working with, like once a month, I come in and lead worship for them on Sunday, and I'm also doing some other consulting with them. And I guess the very first Sunday that was technically part of this process, I can't believe they even did this, that they've let me do this with them. I said, instead of having a sermon, I'm going to read some scripture, and we're going to have a very brief conversation. But then I want you to go out for 45 minutes into your community and just look and observe, and then come back, and we're going to share what we saw. Most of the people in this church don't live in the neighborhood where their church is located, which is all too common. So some of them walked in the park. Some of them walked through the residential area. Some of them went to the pub and had a beer. Some of them went to the coffee shop where there was a live jazz band. And they came back and said, wow, there's a lot of life in this neighborhood outside of this church. I'm like, no kidding. And they said, I'd rather go there than here. I said, I know. But what if what we did here looked more like that? Or what if we just said, this building is sort of a launching pad, but we're going to spend more time out there doing church and being church. And that, I think, is one of the big things, is you got to get out into those spaces. What else? Yes, ma'am.
I would like to say a little bit more about evangelism. What it is you're actually saying. And I appreciated your emphasis on doing, but then it also involves speaking as the holistic approach. But what I heard you saying is that evangelism is a very expensive experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just say the difficulty I see with that is that when you're talking with people who are spiritual or not religious, you're just sort of trading experiences. But I'm just wondering if you could say more what it is.
Yeah, what the content is. Yeah. One thing I do a lot of times, I didn't do it today, I guess I could have, is to start off my talk with what I call like the evangelism pop quiz. We're just going to do this. So, and the people online, the question is, what is the content of what we're sharing? So here's what I want you to do. I'm going to give you 30 seconds. No, I'm going to give you 1 minute to think about this. If you want to write it down, you can. I want you to turn to your neighbor after this hour and share with them your definition of the gospel. But you only got 2 or 3 sentences max. I don't want you to use more than 3 sentences. So I'm going to set my timer. I'm going to give you 1 minute to think about it. I apologize online for the dead space here, but you can do this at home too. You got 1 minute to think about it, or if you want to write it down, write it down. But you got 2 or 3 sentences. Go. You didn't know you were going to get this. Don't talk yet. You guys are just thinking. You're thinking. You're writing. And you got 30 more seconds. All right. Now turn to your neighbor and share with them your 2 or 3 sentence definition of the gospel. Go. All right. Have you both had a chance to share your thing? Yeah? All right. So you're probably never going to ask the question of an evangelism professor again. The reason I do that, and I'm not going to ask you to share like publicly what you said, but if you're at all like Presbyterians or other mainline Protestants that I know, you probably, especially because you're in a seminary community, you probably came up with some sort of answer that's really doctrinal or dogmatic. You didn't. That's good. You're not like Presbyterians. Congratulations. We tend to think in terms of theology or doctrine or dogma, just partly because that's the way that we're trained to. Like the gospel is, the atoning work of Jesus Christ on the cross. That doesn't mean anything to a real person. Okay. Instead, if you can talk about your experience, yes, but not just like in the sense of we're trading experiences. Why does this matter to you? Right. So there's a book that I like to recommend, and I recommend it to you, called Unbinding the Gospel by Martha Grace Reese. Some of you maybe have used this or seen it. So this is based on a Lilly Endowment funded study of mainline Protestant churches that do evangelism well. So let that sink in. That's some good news. There are mainline Protestant churches that do evangelism well. And her point is your theological perspective or orientation is not any indicator of whether or not you can do evangelism. The greatest indicator of whether or not you can do effective evangelism is if you're able to give a succinct answer to the question, why does following Jesus matter in your life? Which is what people want to hear. So they are less concerned about, these theological minutia or what your church formally believes about, Jesus or whatever. What they want to know is, why does being a disciple of Jesus actually matter in your life? And if you can't sort of convey that, and that's different, that's fundamentally different than saying, what do you believe? Presbyterians, at least, one of the questions that we most ask ourselves is, what do you believe? And we're always writing statements of faith. We expect our people that are going to be ordained as pastors to write statements of faith. And when we do confirmation with adolescents, we ask them to write statements of faith, and we produce a bunch as a denomination. And there's a lot of value to that. But we very rarely make the step of saying, why does that matter to me? How am I a different person because I follow Jesus, because I connect with God in the way of Jesus? Or another question that Martha Grace Reese uses in that book that I think is a good one is to say, what was the most important time in your life with God? Like, when did you feel closest to God? And what was that like for you? That's, again, a fundamentally different way of talking about good news than here is my understanding of the Trinity. Or here's what I think happened, on the cross. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think I teach theology. I want to defend it.
Sure.
I think we bring people first.
Sure. Yeah. And I'm not saying there's not a place for that, but to lead off with it, I just did a class, an online class that was primarily for within our tradition, what we call commission ruling elders now, which are folks that are like lay people that do some training and are commissioned to serve as a pastor for a particular body or a particular congregation. Then other folks were invited to be a part of this class. And so I asked them that same question. Like their final little paper was, what is your definition of the gospel? What is your definition of evangelism? What is your understanding of God's mission in the world, and how do you feel called to be a part of that? The response that I can almost cut and paste my same feedback on all of their definitions of the gospel, is that you're speaking Christianese. You're speaking a language that most people don't understand. The scriptural place that I turn to the most as a way to show what this looked like in the first century is Paul on Mars Hill in Athens in Acts 17. Go back, and read that. Paul expresses his understanding of the gospel that clearly is connected to the way that we read about Paul everywhere else. But what's different is he doesn't use a single biblical name. He doesn't even use Jesus's name, but he lays it all out there and does it in a way that the Athenians can understand. In fact, he quotes their prophets or their poets more than the Bible. That's what I think it means to do evangelism in today's world for people that no longer have even the fundamental rudimentary understanding of the Bible or theology, which we could always take for granted. And when we did evangelism 50, 60, 100 years ago, almost everyone in the United States had that underlying understanding of Christianity. And so, we didn't have to start from square one. Now we have to start from square one. And I think what's most compelling for folks is here's how this has changed who I am. Here's my experience of that. What else? I think we got like 12 more minutes. Yeah. Sure. Right. Yeah. 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 So the question is how do you do these sort of alternative, non-traditional church expressions, especially like the third place coffee shop, theology pub sort of expression? How do you start that, and how do you get paid to do that? How do you make that sustainable? I get asked that question a lot, and I have two responses for that. One is I don't think that in traditional church are mutually exclusive. That I think one of the problems with that attractional traditional church model is that we tend to put almost all of our resources into meeting the needs of the people that are already there. And so we keep doing the same thing over and over. If we were to figure out ways, and this is hard, to free up some time to say that some of those things will probably run themselves even without me, or maybe we don't need all these things and we should invest in some other opportunities that they can coexist, that the traditional, and this is important because I know sometimes I come across as sounding like traditional model's dead, so stop wasting your time. It's not meaningful or worthwhile. That's not what I'm saying, because it clearly meets the needs of lots of people, and it is the medium through which they connect with God in a profound way. So I don't want to mess that up. But we have to also be investing in these other expressions, and they can happen simultaneously. One of the books and the models out there that I recommend a lot, I think it's good, is Keith Anderson's The Digital Cathedral. He's a Lutheran pastor, and it's a bad title and even worse cover because it looks like it's a book on how to use like social media and digital technology to do church. He already wrote that book. This book is the metaphor that's driving it is that of cathedral. He starts with Canterbury Cathedral and says what made those cathedrals so interesting and unique is they were integrally woven into the community that surrounded them, and that they were connected. And so it's the in cathedral metaphor is to say we have to have this more expansive notion of church. That it can't just be what happens in our building on the corner. Sort of like reclaiming this older idea of a parish, which is that where I serve is this entire community, not just here. And so those things can happen simultaneously. Like we can do the traditional Sunday morning service and the theology pub at the same time. Now, it may be, you only have so much capacity that you have to not do something over here. But I think that's a choice that we have to make now. The other response, so that's like the both and response. The other response is I do think that we need to have pastors and church leaders that are just doing the third place model. And the question of how to support that is a real one. On the one hand, I think that we need to sort of revive within the larger established churches the kind of missionary support mentality that they had 100 years ago. Every big tall steeple church in America 100 years ago proudly talked about the foreign missionaries that they supported and would tell you stories about it. Now, who's doing that today? And if you take, the Leslie Newbegin sort of missional church conversation seriously, and I think we need to, but we haven't for the last 40 years, is that our most pressing mission field is right here in our own culture. We ought to be supporting missionaries within our own culture in the same way that we supported foreign missionaries, in generations past. So that's on the one hand. The other thing is, I think that you really do, we have to start thinking more realistically and seriously about bivocational tent-making ministry, which no one wants to hear because it's hard. And it is hard, and it takes a lot of time, and it's really difficult, especially after you've gone through 3+ years of theological education, to say, I'm going to go back to, be a barista and somehow find a ministry on the side of that. But I think that actually is where we're heading as a culture and a church, and we have to be open to that. And so, I keep saying that, and I'm trying to live that out myself. I'm trying to put my money, I guess, where my mouth is, or whatever, preach what I teach. So for me, I'm on a 4-year appointment at the seminary in the presbytery. So I knew when I moved my family across the country to Richmond from Chicago that this is just for a short time. And so from day one, I'm like, what's going to be next? The most natural thing for me to do would be to go back into a traditional church as a senior pastor or something. But instead, my wife and I bought a food truck, and this Joyful Feast ministry is connected to the barbecue stuff. And so I'm intentionally trying to set myself up so that 2 years from now, I'm able to go into something else and have that not only sustain my ministry, but put me in the midst of the people that I think God's calling me to serve. So not only does that become a way to sustain the ministry I feel called to, that's the mission field that I feel called to, and those things coincide. So I think we have to do more of that. Just one other thing, and this I know it probably sounds horrible when I say it, but I think there's maybe something to it, and we ought to at least explore it. And granted, it's going to only connect us to a certain privileged few. Let's face it, most people in our churches are that same privileged few. In a culture where people are willing to pay for life coaches and personal trainers, I don't think it's far-fetched to think that there's a business model, so to speak, for spiritual direction that isn't reliant on a congregation, soliciting donations to support a building and a staff. That why couldn't I have 10 sort of micro congregations of people that meet in their homes or at the theology or at the pub or the coffee shop, and I'm their spiritual director and I'm their pastor, and they find a way to support me in the same way that these 10 people are paying premium money for their CrossFit gym. So that sounds kind of bad. Maybe it sounds like simony, I don't know. But it seems like it's not all that different than what we're already doing. And I guess, people say, well, gosh, that bivocational ministry, that's really hard. I said, well, is it any less hard to maintain a church and get people to pay you to do it? No, I'd say it's even harder in this culture, because there's not the same mentality about giving and charitable contributions as there used to be, which also is an evangelism problem. I mean, part of the problem we can't support our ministries is because we really suck at telling them why they're important. And so they'd rather give to something else than to us because we haven't made the case that we're actually changing the world. We say that we are, but maybe we're not. Yeah. Yeah.
So you mentioned food truck. I was here late with my wife. That you do barbecue.
Mm-hmm.
I do barbecue as well.
All right.
In 2 years, we're going to open barbecue point with Canfield that hires recovering addicts.
Cool.
With the bridge between the church recovery place.
Yeah.
They do a good job. So the goal right now is training my church leadership to do things that current church folks think pastors do.
Yeah.
Like go and sit, hold hands with the widows, or
right.
Go visit. Everybody who's stuck their toes.
Right.
Like, just the constant. Train the deacons to do that. It's your role as a deacon. Mm-hmm. You're the visitation. When you're in hospital, sick, absolutely, pastor would be there. But my role is more out in the community.
Right.
We're starting to see the fruits of that. People, Easter Sunday, we had a large group of sinners who had never seen the church.
That's great.
So I think there's something worthy to it. It's like you said, it's the willingness to go. Maybe I'm not going to retire as a senior pastor like
yeah.
my forefathers, but
right.
I can stay connected to the church and also do something else. When you look back, like when you go to the art, you get something.
Right. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right on. Yeah, and I totally agree with you that pastors are asked to do tons of things that people ought to be doing for themselves, like some of those what we call pastoral care visits. I mean, I agree that there's a place for us in certain crisis moments, but I maintain, and you could argue with me that this is not right, that my prayers as an ordained clergy person aren't more effective or meaningful than the prayers of someone else from the congregation. And why do I need to be the one, especially when I talk to small church or rural pastors? That's what I hear all the time. I don't have time to do something new because I'm so busy visiting every single person every week. I'm like, well, stop visiting them. They'll be okay. Or train them to visit each other. There's a great program. Unfortunately, I think maybe some of the training is expensive, but it's a worthwhile investment to do Stephen ministry, where you train lay people. And a lot of times they end up, I think, getting more and maybe better pastoral care training than a lot of our seminary grads. And they can do that work, All right. I see that it's 10:30 or 12:30. Do we need to stop? Yeah, we're all finished. Thanks a lot for your time and for your good questions. And
thank you, John. I'm going to say a blessing for our meal, and we can continue the conversation, but I feel led that we should stand and sing 4 stanzas of Just As I Am. How about, this is your opportunity. No, yeah, 6. Sorry, there's 6. Maybe we'll do that later. Anyway, John, thank you again. Let's pray for this meal we're about to have and just give thanks back to God today. Let us pray. God, we're grateful for this word we've heard, Lord, and help us to think creatively as we carry out your mission, this gospel, into the community and into the world. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.